There is a common myth about the American Revolution, stated by both fringe groups such as the Three Percenters, as well as more reputable sources such as teachers and textbooks. And this myth claims that the American Revolution succeeded despite the fact that only a small percent of Americans supported the American Revolution. And the most common form of this myth is the claim that 1/3 of Americans were patriots, they wanted independence, 1/3 of Americans were loyalists, they did not want independence, and 1/3 were neutral, they didn't really care. This claim is false, and in this video I will be explaining where it comes from and why it is false. So this myth has its origins in a letter that John Adams sent in 1815, in which he stated, quote, "If I were called to calculate the divisions among the people of America, as Mr. Burke did those of the people of England, I should say that a full 1/3 were averse to the Revolution. An opposite third conceived a hatred of the English, and gave themselves up to an enthusiastic gratitude to France. The middle third, composed principally of the yeomanry, the soundest part of the nation, and always averse to war, were rather lukewarm both to England and France, and sometimes stragglers from them, and sometimes the whole body, united with the first or the last third, according to circumstances." As you may notice, this is a strange way of talking about the American Revolution, if that's what Adams is referring to, and the reason is that Adams is not referring to the American Revolution. He is actually referring to an event 2 decades later. In the 1790s, there were a series of wars between France and Britain, among other powers, and that is what Adams is referring to. The revolution that he talked about was actually the French Revolution, and what he was saying was that, in his estimation, about 1/3 of Americans wanted the US to intervene on the British side in those wars, about 1/3 of Americans wanted the US to intervene on the French side, and about 1/3 of Americans did not want the US to intervene at all. So this 1/3 estimate actually has nothing to do with the American Revolution. So if that number is false, then what percent of Americans actually did support the revolution? We can't know for certain, since people didn't exactly take public opinion polls at the time, but there are certain ways that we have of estimating. So one way is that we can make estimates based on individual colonies. And if we're going to do that, then the most useful data comes from Connecticut. In the Connecticut provincial elections of 1774, Loyalist candidates won only about 2,600 votes each out of about 38,000 potential voters. Using this, it can be estimated that Loyalists only represented less than 7% of the adult male population, and this percentage is somewhat supported by contemporary religious, demographics, and military estimates. So if 7% of the population is loyalist, then that makes the other 93% of the population either patriots or neutral. Now obviously, what is true of Connecticut will not hold true of every other state, but the fact that the population was so overwhelmingly anti-loyalist suggests that the 1/3 figure is not true. Another thing that we can do is just listen to what historians are saying. So one source I read says that, quote, "Historians' best estimates put the proportion of adult white male loyalists somewhere between 15 and 20%. Approximately half of the colonists of European ancestry tried to avoid involvement in the struggle, some of them deliberate pacifists, others recent emigrants, and many more simple apolitical folk. The Patriots received active support from perhaps 40 to 45% of the white populace." Now, 45% is still not a majority, but it is 2 or 3 times the number of loyalists, which is much higher than the equal number of patriots and loyalists that is often claimed. Another historian that I read, who explains how they got their percentages, in particular about the loyalists, says, quote, "Careful tabulation of the data on the over 6,000 loyalists for whom a contemporary demographer collected biographical information reveals that 895 men, or approximately 15%, were in the provincial service. Thus, if the approximately 9,000 loyalists who served in the provincial corps constituted about 15% of the whole, then the total number of adult male loyalists slightly exceeded 128,000. Finally, as the ratio of adult male loyalists to the whole number of persons in loyalist families was very near to 1 to 4, we can calculate that the total number of Americans who may be classed as loyalists between 1775 and 1783 was very near 500,000. Hence, my final estimate is that the loyalists comprised about 16%, 513,000 out of 3,210,000 of the total population, or 19.8% of the white Americans. Obviously, there's a lot of assumptions and extrapolation in this particular number, but it does seem to match with the other estimates that we have. And so finally, another way that we can say that the 1/3 estimate is false is to just use common sense. There is no way that the American Revolution would have been able to get off the ground, let alone defeat the most powerful empire in the world, if it faced equal opposition at home than it did support. It just would not have been possible that way. And so we know from that and from all of our other sources that the 1/3 claim is false. So thank you for watching. Hopefully you learned the truth about a common misconception about the American Revolution. And hopefully you also learned something about how historians go about estimating public support in an era before public opinion surveys.